All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to this is our 5th session in the Safe Systems Summer Learning Series presented by the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety, or CSCRS. My name is Kristen Brookshire, and I'm a research associate at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, where CSCRS is housed. I'm here to give you all a quick orientation, and then I will turn things over to our moderator for today, Seth Lavrenz. So CSCRS was established in 2016 as one of the 5 National University Transportation Research Centers funded by the FAST Act. And we are a consortium of research partners from 5 universities: UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, Florida Atlantic University, UC Berkeley, and University of Tennessee, Knoxville, with many of our students and researchers participating in or helping to moderate this series. If you're not yet familiar with CSCRS, our consortium recognizes that transportation challenges are increasingly complex and interconnected, and that this demands new skills and approaches to problem solving. We bring together expertise in engineering, planning, robotics and data science, public health, and other fields to develop new ways to approach our most enduring and complex safety issues. So 2 years ago, our consortium held its first conference, the Safe Systems Summit, which was organized around systems-oriented approaches to address transportation safety challenges. We introduced concepts around safe systems and systems science, which can be used to explore system assumptions and interactions. And in this summer learning series that you're here for today, we continue to host a space, this time virtually, to share ideas and questions around these concepts and to reflect upon the ways in which we as a research and practice community can both appreciate the complexity of the transportation system while continuing to foster shared goals and identify new innovative ways to address enduring safety issues. So for today, I want to remind everyone that the session is being recorded and that it will be posted online. You can use the chat box within Zoom to introduce yourself, and throughout the session, you can use it to share observations, to post questions for the panelists to consider, and resources that are relevant for the group gathered today. And I want you to take a look at the chat. It defaults to panelists only, and in most cases, you're probably going to be sharing something that's for everyone to see, so make sure that you switch it to everyone so that other attendees also have a chance to see and respond. And we'll let the panelists go for a little while before our moderator might take a moment to look for any questions in the chat. But if you're inclined to tweet today, you can use our hashtag at the bottom of the slide, CSCRS Learning. And so now I will turn it over to our moderator, Seth Lavrenz. He's an Associate Director of Health and Community Sciences at the Highway Safety Research Center, and he's involved in a lot of CSCRS projects. And you may have heard from him as a panelist on a prior summer learning session. He designs studies that draw from psychology, sociology, and system science to explore ways of accelerating the diffusion of travel mode shift and safety innovations. Formerly a school psychologist, Seth also holds a master's degree in city and regional planning from UNC Chapel Hill. Seth?
Thanks so much, Kristen, and welcome everyone. Very happy to have you here with us. I do want to just start off by introducing the wonderful people that are here joining me and Kristen today. We have 4 people that excel in so many different ways and in their own ways, and we are just so pleased to have them here. These include Kelsey Ralph, who is an associate professor of transportation planning and policy at the Blueston School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. I hope I got that right, Kelsey. In her research, Dr. Ralph works to identify and correct common misperceptions about travel behavior and safety to improve transportation planning outcomes. Welcome, Kelsey. And we have Christy Kwan here as well. She's the co-chair and member of the DC chapter of Families for Safe Streets, which confronts traffic violence in Washington, DC through advocacy and peer support. Christy's cousin Jamie died 20 years ago in a car crash. Today, Christy volunteers to organize families and survivors so that no other families suffer the loss or life-altering injuries that have, as we know, physically, emotionally, and spiritually impacted our communities. She lives in the near Northeast neighborhood in Washington, D.C. with her family, and also volunteers to plant trees throughout the city and chairs her her neighborhood's transportation committee. Thanks so much for planting trees as well, Christy, in addition to all the things that you do. And next we have Stephen Lavrenz. He's an associate professor in the Wayne State University Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He's a subject matter expert on transportation safety, operations, and intelligent transportation services, or ITS. And he consults on a variety of local, federal, and international partners. Much of his research is focused on roadway safety and multimodal transportation, including work with safe systems and Vision Zero, as well as surrogate measures of safety and conflict analysis. Welcome, Steve, reporting from your office. And last but certainly not least, we have Tamika L. Butler, who most of you probably know. She is a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. As the principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting, she focuses on shining a light on the inequality, inequity, and social justice. Indeed, Tamika has a diverse background, a very welcome one, in law, community organizing, and nonprofit leadership. So I welcome all of you. Thanks so much for joining us today. For those who are at home or in the office, very unlikely outside, given the heat we're having across the country. If you are, though, if you want to put it in the chat, if you're outside, you get extra points for today. Welcome. The way we'll do this today is that I'll pose a question to our esteemed colleagues here, and it'll be mostly about the way the system is operating today with respect to shared responsibility. The first question will be what they all think about what shared responsibility means, right? So if you're familiar at all with safe systems, the last few years of Vision Zero, you've probably heard some things about it, about some of the principles around these programs, which is about the fact that humans are fallible, we make mistakes, we are vulnerable, right? That therefore we need to manage speeds, we need to not accept serious and fatal injury, and we need to share responsibility. So today, that's what we're focusing on. Earlier in the learning series, we focused on the meaning of safety. We're doing something quite similar today, unpacking the term shared responsibility. So I suppose one of the things we can do is, in the order I sort of introduced everybody, just pose a question about how would you define shared responsibility for injury and death on our roads? Kelsey, we can start with you.
Sorry, I got caught up in the chat there. So thanks, Seth, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for all of our panelists. I'm so excited to get a chance to talk with each of you. So when I think about shared responsibility, I think most importantly about the systems underlying all of the behaviors. So we're so interested in individuals. It's a natural tendency. We shouldn't feel bad about that. But as transportation professionals, our responsibility is to move beyond individuals to think about systems. So that's what I think of with shared responsibility.
Thank you for that, Kelsey. Yes, it's true. We need to look beyond the individual. That's a wonderful way to look at it. How about you, Christy? What's your take on this shared responsibility construct?
Having a view of shared responsibility is incredibly important because, as you mentioned in my introduction, my cousin Jamie died in a car crash 20 years ago. Here's her photo that I'll share. I'm actually not in this photo because I was not born yet, but she's the one in the middle. She died in a car crash because she actually was drinking and driving. She was 24 at the time and I was 18, and this happened in Southern California where we grew up. And so I would say actually for 18 years of my life, those 18 years after her death, I really took her death as a personal mistake to drink and drive. And actually, Kelsey and I were chatting right before this. I actually went to planning school and worked in transportation planning and still do, but in a different mode. And not really understanding the connections and really seeing the bigger picture of shared responsibility for 18 years of my life. I always saw her death as a personal decision that had happened and unfortunately resulted in her death. And I think we need to reframe shared responsibility, looking at the systems that have created the circumstances of her death. She was driving in Irvine, California, a very suburban area. It's a ranch development. There's no public transit available for her at the time. She also was just young and just out to have a good time. She was actually getting ready to graduate from grad school. There's all these decisions in terms of how we've laid out our communities, but not really, when a fatal crash happens, not really taking a step back and taking a look at what are the systems that happen and failed people who are either in fatal crashes or even injured, seriously injured in crashes. We're not taking that step back to look at what are the other things that we can change other than individual behaviors.
Thank you, Christy. Really appreciate you sharing your family's perspective on this, really shining a light on the systems through this tragedy that happened to your family. Steve, how about you? How would you define this shared responsibility idea?
Make sure I'm unmuted here. Yeah, thanks, Seth. So I guess as a transportation engineer, working a lot with public agencies and infrastructure owner operators, I think a shared responsibility in two levels primarily. The first one is, I think, obviously the shared responsibility with road users and people who travel on the roads. I think shared responsibility is more about not having the mentality of, well, I designed the road according to the Green Book or according to, MUTCD, like I followed the rules. And if you got in a crash and you got injured or God forbid killed, well, that's your problem. Like I gave you a road, that follows all the standards. So it's up to you to make sure that you're using it correctly. So I think it's a matter of kind of taking back some of that ownership when failures do happen. The other thing I think about in terms of the other level of shared responsibility is even within the agency itself. So there's a lot of different groups and stakeholders within government, city government, state, federal, whatever. Everyone from the engineers to the planners to law enforcement. Everyone has this sort of ethereal concept of safety in mind. Like we're all kind of working towards making roads safer, but we still very often are siloed, or even if we are trying not to be siloed, we're not fully understanding what everyone else is doing, and we're not understanding our role in the actions and activities of other stakeholders and other agencies. So it's also about kind of developing a deeper understanding and a shared ownership of, what I'm doing over here in my engineering corner, has some impact on you over here in the law enforcement corner, or you over here in the planning corner, just kind of developing a greater recognition of those impacts across the system.
Thanks for that perspective. Yeah, so seeing our own role, whatever position we're in, as also kind of contributing to what we see in the system, the outcomes that we see. I appreciate that. And Tamika, what is your take on all this?
Thank you so much, Seth, and
Yeah.
Thanks for having me as part of this illustrious group. I don't have much to add to what my colleagues have said, other than I think shared responsibility is important. It's something we're hearing about right now with vaccines, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all have our personal rights, but as I heard somebody say yesterday, your right to swing your arm ends when it hits my nose, right? And so I think we have to think about the ways we can all come together and in many aspects of life, and transportation isn't excluded there, to think about how our actions impact others' actions. The thing I will say that's always like kind of tingled my spidey senses about the use of the term shared responsibility is I think too often it's used to blame our most vulnerable road users, right? And so yes, I believe in shared responsibility, but as someone who bikes, I don't want to be blamed when someone can't see me, despite, you know, all the colors I'm wearing, all of the safety protocols I'm following, all of the hand signaling, because they aren't paying attention. I don't want, you know, to be blamed if I'm crossing the street and happen to look at my watch or phone, that it's my fault, right? And so I think that shared responsibility isn't a concept that we should throw out. I think it's important. I think it's crucial to talking about safety in our transportation system. But I think we can't talk about shared responsibility without acknowledging power dynamics, without acknowledging to something my colleagues have said, the way our built environment currently is, and what that prioritizes and who it prioritizes. And so I think shared responsibility is something that, again, is critical, as long as we acknowledge that we're not all starting from the same place in that system of shared responsibility. And some people might have more responsibility. And historically, we think that some people is, again, the vulnerable users. And I think we really need to work on switching that paradigm.
Yeah. Thank you, Tamika. Yeah, for sharing that perspective around those with kind of the least amount of power, right, are often the ones blamed for outcomes and things. And just speaking more generally to the distribution of power, whenever we speak about shared responsibility, we are talking about power dynamics, right? So thank you for that perspective, really, really valuable. So yeah, now I think we'll transition to really, one of the things we like to do in systems, I guess to just sort of couch this a little bit, is we like to kind of look and listen to the system as it is. So the next set of questions for our esteemed colleagues here really going to get at where things stand today, and maybe start broaching or exploring why that might be. And then later, if we have time, we don't know how chatty everyone is today, but hopefully, if we have time, and people ask really good questions in here, we may not have time, right? But to get to maybe what are some things we can do to improve our situation right now, right? Because right now I think we're all in consensus here that the general consensus is there is this sort of individualism that we see that's pretty pervasive. There is this sort of blaming of victims. There is an exoneration of responsibility, right, among certain actors in the system. So I think that's what we'll hopefully get to. But in terms of describing the system as is, I'm going to pose again, go back to our colleague Kelsey here and ask, you know, in our field, we, as you know, right, and you've written about and thought about, no doubt, about all these calls for political will to address traffic safety. We also hear laments, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen it personally, about why does no one care about this, right? The lack of public concern around traffic violence and injury. So if you were to describe the system today, where would you say these political will and this public concern over in road user injury stands in the US?
Sure. So I have so many thoughts about this. The first is that the level of political concern is shockingly low, right? 100 people are dying on our streets every other day or every day. And that's like an airplane falling out of the sky every other day. And you can imagine if that were the case, that every front page of every newspaper would be covered with coverage about this. And in turn, we would have a sense of urgency about addressing this issue. But the slow accretion of deaths means that we just don't notice in the same way that we would if they all happened all at once. And I also think to Tamika's point about power, the people who die in crashes, there's a tendency to say those are other, they're not like me, they don't deserve the same sense of urgency around their lives. So I want to say that it's low, but thanks to the work of many advocates like Christy, like those in this room, there's a growing sense of concern. So I want to make sure we emphasize that this trend is moving in the right direction. But what I want to speak to is this sense that if the way that we think about problems shapes how we go about solving them. And so even with more concern, if we don't frame the problem properly, we're going to sort of run in the wrong direction as we go about solving it. So I want to talk about 3 different ways that we can think about framing the traffic safety issue. And we sort of fall into these frames just incredibly naturally. One is this idea that the victims are responsible, right? This is the fault of the pedestrian who darted out into the street or wasn't wearing the right colors. And that's a really, really easy narrative to fall into. And something I've talked quite a bit about how the evidence base isn't great for pedestrians being at fault. But the other version of this safety individualism story is to focus just on drivers who are driving recklessly, drivers who are speeding. And I want to be really clear that these folks are responsible for a large number of crashes, but they're not the only thing. Many, many people acting responsibly within an unsafe system lead to crashes, right? We know that a street that's 45 miles an hour with no sidewalk and lots of driveways is going to eventually lead to a crash. And at those speeds, someone will be killed or injured. So then we need this third causal story that is, it's not about individuals, it is about a system that leads to this problem. And in my work, I'm exploring sort of the historical context of these 3 different perspectives. And you can see over time that they sort of ebb and flow. You know, we first get cars and we blame reckless drivers. And then we see this historical shift that no, if we keep blaming reckless drivers, there won't be any space for drivers at all. So let's instead blame the pedestrian. And after, a couple decades of pedestrian blaming and the invention of jaywalking, we sort of get around to developing safer systems. But we've cycled back through each of these different categories. And it was exciting, and with the Complete Streets movement and the Vision Zero movement, to really sort of refocus on the system. But then you see very quickly a very big pushback towards victim blaming, blaming pedestrians in particular, basically with distraction. And so I think one of the things I want to emphasize is that it's growing, our concern, but that we need to be careful about how we frame it. And I think I'll leave it at that for now.
That's great, Kelsey. Thank you for that. Do other colleagues have any reaction to what Kelsey has just offered here with respect to sort of the historical trajectory that we're on? Thank you for that, Kelsey. How we sort of focus on individuals, pull back and say, no, it is systems, but then, have this sort of knee-jerk response again and go back to default to safety individualism. And how, even though concern is increasing, right, you really want to get it right. Because what if it just doubled down on jaywalking, issuing of jaywalking tickets, right? You can see that maybe occurring. That could be a bad outcome from this, right?
Well, and I just want to say one thing too, is that this happens so naturally, right? It is so much easier to do an education campaign where you say, don't drive distracted, don't walk distracted. We've solved the problem. But it is incredibly difficult to be a practicing planner and go to a city meeting and say, here are the safety improvements we want to make, because you will be yelled at, right? It inconveniences drivers, and that's like a politically tricky position to be in. One, I think we should sort of have the courage to face and do. That's our responsibility. But it is no surprise that we prefer education over hard infrastructure changes.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy and it's sort of feel good, right, Kelsey? Yeah, I mean,
no one goes out and pickets about the education campaign to wear a helmet, right? But people do come out to say we don't need these bike boxes or whatever.
Yes, yeah, that's a great point. I can imagine a lot of the people joining us here today have probably been involved with meetings like that, where we're talking about larger system changes, and there's a lot of pushback, a lot of reactance to that, right? Particularly by certain voices that tend to be more privileged and more time affluent than most others. So if there's no further, I mean, I think we've put that to bed, right? We've thoroughly described that. So we can, I think, move on and ask Christy, if you would, just sort of this idea that basically, as we said from the outset, that scores of people are injured. 40,000 a year on average die on our roads, right? And when people, probably about 6 years ago, we estimate, when the authority figures woke up to this reality, they basically, they went the route that Kelsey has described in terms of educating the public, but also just even viewing the system or the problem, the injury and death on our roads as more of a private matter. How, if at all, have you seen this sort of private issue view of road trauma changing in recent years?
Yeah, it's been changing on a trajectory of gaining more awareness. Families for Safe Streets was actually started in New York City. Mostly, many of you may know Amy Cohen, who lost her son, Sammy, where in New York City, and in addition to some parents in New Jersey, they all got together to formulate Families for Safe Streets to start to demand for change in New York City. And as other impacted individuals throughout the country saw the power of Families for Safe Streets in New York, started to basically call Amy Cohen up and say, how can I start a chapter in my own city? Like, I've been affected, I've lost my son, I lost my cousin, I've been injured in a crash. There are way too many of us. And I think actually a lot of us have been quietly grieving or suffering through our traumas or trying to deal with it on this individual basis, but there was not a support group of sorts or a collective of us, or even in like group therapy, like it was hard to find people with the similar experiences unless like you actually like start to kind of talk to your local advocacy organizations and find others who've been impacted. And so with the work starting through New York City and gaining that momentum of showcasing this is what it's like to lose a family member, for us to unfortunately talk about our lives in a very personal way, in a very public setting, whether it's on a rally on the steps of a city hall, or telling your story of the loss of a loved one, testifying at a state legislature. It's quite difficult. And to be honest, for impacted individuals to relive your grief and trauma on a public stage just to get an elected official to care is actually kind of bananas. And I think this is probably likely one of the ways where we've been trying to gain that attention, because as Kelsey mentioned, it just seems almost everyday, accepted, normal, not preventable that people are injured and die on our streets. And the only way that we've been capturing that attention is to share our story and sort of do this unfortunate performative art piece where we lay it all out for people to care. And so actually one way that DC Families for Safe Streets is trying to honor the personal experience, but not tokenize people for their personal experience, is actually on their own terms to gather their stories, whether it's written, a recorded Zoom interview, or we haven't yet found someone who wants to do another artistic medium, but however they want to express themselves and to have control over their own story. We want to publish it on our website, make a PDF of it or some other interactive form. And we've just been attaching that to our testimonies for public officials, because we actually don't think it's fair that we have to be out there crying and demanding for safer streets just because we have this personal experience. And we want to honor people's experiences, but not trot them out for display. And so it's still taken out quite a bit of time for people to care and to actually do something about it within their capacity. It is quite hard to, as previous colleagues have mentioned, to get all of the actors in line. You might have a sympathetic council member, but then to try to carry forward some of that changes to a street design, for example, to your local Department of Transportation might be a whole other experience. And in DC, we have to do something called a traffic safety assessment. We fill out a form and we submit it to the Department of Transportation, and they have to do a study, and then they may or may not agree that a stop sign should go there, and it's just bananas. And this process takes a year. And I understand, you want to have due process, you want to see the numbers, you want to make sure the neighbors are immediately comfortable with it so they don't immediately have this knee-jerk reaction. But it is quite performative. And I wish we would get to a space where we have some clear guidance of, yes, there's a high crash area, or yes, the residents want this and we need to move forward from a systems approach versus this individual action of just crashes and having people to bear the burden to carry forward something that we should be doing as good city building.
Yeah, thank you for that, Christy. It's very interesting to hear about your perspective about this. You know, this victim advocacy. This is very, we framed it as a personal issue, but I mean, it's very grief-stricken, right, material. And like you said, they have to go out there and perform, right, in the hopes that maybe there's some change. One question I kind of had about your work with DC Families for Safe Streets was, to what extent do you think a lot of the engagement is actually kind of seeking support from people who have experienced something similar, vis-a-vis, say, trying to, you know, change the community? No doubt, I mean, really appreciate that role that you and everyone plays in that space. Just wondering about that. It seems like there's sort of multiple perspectives.
Yeah, and so we've adapted the mission where we have two main components, is that advocacy piece and the peer support piece. When we formed in 2019, so in the before times, right in the before times, we thankfully had a supportive council who was starting to entertain and to come up and draft up legislation that was ultimately passed, called the Vision Zero Omnibus Bill. And so we did do our work to support and submit testimony and like participated in the 8-hour hearing. But what we've also been doing is really focusing on how do we build our group and how do we support one another. We did have one in-person support meeting before the pandemic began. And so we have actually shifted towards working with other chapters to offer support meetings over Zoom, which has been helpful, where we've had breakout rooms for people who've lost loved ones or people who've been injured in a crash, because we realize there are different dynamics there. And actually, sometimes when you get both of the groups together, it's good for all of us to be together, but we actually saw that a lot of times those who've been severely injured have a feeling of, oh, I'm lucky that I survived my crash, and then stop talking and don't want to relate or bother those who've lost loved ones. And so it's been very interesting in that way. We're figuring out what are the different needs and what are the spaces that we can provide them where they can share some of the details that they don't have someone to talk to about. For example, like we've all individually thought this, and we came together as a group and we all decided we all hate the word healing, because actually most of us feel like we can never be healed. It's something that we just have endured or acknowledged, and how do we move and grow from there? And so we've discovered this on our own, and it's just finding ways to kind of build up our camaraderie with each other. So therefore, when there is an advocacy action, that we are feeling restored to participate in it. And I think a lot of us do participate in our own local neighborhood transportation meetings and decisions about street design, but generally as a group for advocacy work, we try to aim for those higher policy decisions and legislative decisions, and also empower members to kind of individually work on their own in their neighborhoods of the issues that they see.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for providing the history of where you've been, you know, and how it's probably changed a lot in these after times, or whatever times we're in now, right? Thank you for that, Christy. I really appreciate you clarifying that. And it's funny, you seemed, and everyone, all of our discussions seemed to really inspire a great deal of really substantive commenting in the chat. I don't know if you had a chance to look at this, but everyone's responding to what you all are saying, and really, really wonderful. Thank you. Keep this up, this side conversation, if you will. I think it adds richness to this discussion. Steve, if I may pick on you now. You know, you foreshadowed this a bit in your definition of shared responsibility, but actually some of the commenting we're seeing, some of our colleagues viewing this right now have shared this as well. This concept is that when two or more people or parties are involved in a crash, when you think about the reporting side of the crash and the liability for damages and injuries, it often falls on the individuals, right? Most of that falls upon them. Yet we know the causes of crashes are complex. We often don't know exactly what causes crashes. They involve interacting factors advanced by different actors playing different roles in our system. So from your perspective, Steve, what role do you think local and state transportation agencies play in protecting road users from injury?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Seth. And again, I mean, I bring a lot of the engineering perspective to this question, but I think it's also relevant for planning and elected officials and other audiences. You know, I think the biggest thing or the biggest deficiency I see nowadays in terms of how we as transportation professionals are failing is we've stopped engineering roads for people, and we're engineering them for cars in a lot of cases now. And I can't remember who made comment earlier. I wanted to build on where I see we're at now in terms of some of the difficulties and like why is the stuff we're doing now, countermeasures and so on, like why are we still seeing crashes? Why are we still seeing deaths and serious injuries? We've spent the better part of the last century perfecting this model of a roadway to move vehicles as quickly and efficiently as possible over long distances. And as engineers and planners and just human beings, we tend to get into this mindset of continually wanting to perfect and increment on and tweak the model that we've got. And I see that as a lot of the underlying issue here is it's like we're trying, we're reaching at anything and everything. We're trying everything we can think of to incrementally change or kind of tweak around the edges this underlying model of a roadway exists to move vehicles, quickly, directly from point A to point B. And let's figure out, how we can try to squeeze in everyone else on the sides. And I mean, that's really like the underlying issue here. As engineers, there's really not very many other areas of engineering where, we develop a product and then someone's not using it correctly or as we foresaw, and so we just blame the user and we say, well, you're just not using it correctly. What we do instead is we maybe take a step back. We see like, where are the problems happening? Can the current model be adjusted? And at the end of the day, if we have to, we end up turning the entire thing on its head and say, well, this path we're going down in terms of, slowing down, speeds a little bit for automobiles, or maybe adding a leading pedestrian interval for pedestrians. I mean, yeah, that's helpful, but those things alone are not going to get us to zero deaths and zero serious injuries. So a lot of it just comes down to taking what we already know in terms of speed and this transfer of kinetic energy. I mean, these are really like the underlying factors that cause death and serious injury on the roadway. And just turning this whole model of operating the roadway on its head and no longer asking, how can we make the roads safer while minimally disrupting the existing paradigm, but also then just saying, kind of taking a step back to basics and say, regardless of the way that you're traveling on the roadway from point A to point B, can you get there efficiently, effectively, and safely? Doesn't matter if you're in a car, doesn't matter if you're on foot, doesn't matter if you're in a bike. You need to be able to achieve that basic mobility from point A to point B. So a lot of it just comes down to that, kind of going back to basics and being able to answer that question regardless of context. Is that basic goal of mobility achievable?
Thank you for that, Steve. Yeah, the role of of your engineering and planning departments is really the kind of an affordance, right? It's that they're allowing it, they're building environments that allow us to be mobile, but yeah, they also are kind of determining in some way how quickly we're going and what we're kind of welcoming, right? Is it driving versus everything else versus walking, cycling, taking the bus, these sorts of things. So yeah, their role might be to provide a little bit more option, like viable option, really start thinking of mobility as this idea of getting from point A to point B safely and having having maybe even some parity in our modal choice, things like this. Does that sort of resonate?
Yeah, I think it's that. And I think the other thing I would add is, to get to back to basics and get to this point of, again, engineering roads for people, not vehicles. We are just generally not very good at communicating with the public and understanding what are the underlying desires and the needs of roadway users. We'll hold planning meetings, public input sessions, that sort of thing. But, very often they revolve around, well, we as the infrastructure owner operator, we've identified a safety issue. So, here are some ideas we've come up with. Look at these, give us your feedback, and, we'll take it under advisement. And I think we're just still not at the point where we are comfortable going to a group of community stakeholders, the general public and so on, and just saying, what are your thoughts on the transportation system? Are you able to move from point A to point B easily? What are, is this working well? Is this not working well? And we're not doing enough of the just listening, going to groups of individuals and saying, tell me what's wrong. Or, tell me what you would like to see as a solution, rather than me pushing information out to you. So I really don't, there are a bunch of engineering and technical solutions to this. And we've written, I don't know, 30 or 40 or more technical manuals and guidebooks and put together all compendium of resources on how we manage speeds, how we, do this and that to improve safety, but we're still not doing a good job of applying the right solution in the right context so that it matches up with the actual needs and desires of the people living around the roadway, using the roadway, and spending day in and day out in that environment.
Steve, can I ask a question? I'm just wondering why it is that we think it's necessary for the public to have to request that. We're operating in this situation where we have the technical answers, but yet we need people to show up at a public meeting and basically do what Christy was saying, this performative act of saying, we're not able to get to where we want to go, and we want to be able to do so safely. I'm all for participation and listening to the public, but maybe we should just do some of this already.
Yeah. I mean, I think, personally, I think a lot of it goes back to, again, just still having this mentality or this notion of, I built you a good roadway, you should be able to use this as, I as the engineer or the roadway professional or the technical expert, I've taken into consideration all the latest resources and tried to balance, all these needs, and I've arrived at an optimal solution. Here's the roadway. If you're having a problem with it, well, that's an issue that you've got to figure out. You're not using it correctly. I think we can also do a lot better job. And again, I'm not directly like a public official or anything, but I think we can do a lot better job providing proactive methods and mechanisms for people to convey those kinds of issues to decision makers. So like the 311 systems, the apps where you can, report safety issues, safety concerns. There's always going to be some level of need just because, there's only a handful of elected officials and thousands or millions of roadway users. There's always going to have to be some level of reporting, but there can also be a lot more, proactivity in terms of the listening and going out and trying to understand at a deeper level what are some of the deficiencies in this so-called well-designed roadway system.
Yeah, appreciate that. And Kelsey, thank you for posing, this really great question around why is it that we are putting this on individuals to take their time and have to consistently express what they need, right? Why isn't that just sort of baked into the process? And people in the chat are really agreeing with you both. We need a paradigm shift. I mean, that's easy enough, right? We can do that by the weekend. And just, exactly. Like just describing the way things are working today. I think there's a lot of consonance here. A lot of people are agreeing with what you guys are talking about. So if we are open to moving on, I'm going to pose probably a dissertation-worthy question almost to Tamika. I do apologize, Tamika. This is a very compounded and complex question, but I have no doubt that you will more than capably respond to it. So things that we've been discussing already, right around Vision Zero and safe systems, these principles that they're pretty common now. We're seeing them that humans are vulnerable, make mistakes. Therefore, we have to proactively, like Steve and Kelsey, you were just talking about, and we have to proactively address safety by managing speed and, of course, sharing responsibility, what we're talking about today. So Tamika, from your perspective, whose voices tend to be included in narratives around fault and responsibility for road trauma? Whose voices tend to be excluded or even repressed? And why does this unbalanced distribution of power matter? Real simple.
Yeah, I think I spoke to this a little bit in my first answer, but also I think it really segues nicely from what Kelsey and Steve were saying. Even if some of these concepts are accepted, so if at least in the practitioner space, right? Like if we at this point have all heard of Vision Zero and know what it is, and we know that different jurisdictions now have high injury networks and are trying to use data to track where folks are the most vulnerable and figure it out, and then plan interventions. And part of that, I think, is what Steve was speaking to, trying to be more conscious about listening and hearing from people what they want. I think the thing we have to realize is I 100% agree with Kelsey. I think sometimes people using equity or community engagement is a way to not take responsibility for things we should just do. And I think part of it is jurisdictions hate to admit, and Steve, alluded to this, they hate to admit they were wrong. Like, we built this road, why isn't it good enough for you now? Well, demographics change, people change, cars have gotten bigger. We're switching. We're trying to do everything we can in the transportation space, some of us to fix climate change. So there are more and more electric vehicles. An electric vehicle can go extremely quick, right? And so we know that as technology and life changes in this country, we can't just say, but I built this road years ago, so isn't it okay now? And we can't rely on people to always do it. So yes, community engagement is important, but I totally agree with Kelsey. We have to figure out when we proactively have to do those things, because when we look at data from things like 311 apps or any program where in order to get a government agency to fix the thing, you have to report it, we know that disproportionately helps wider communities, more affluent communities, people who can navigate those systems, people who have the time, who can figure it out. And so I think when we talk about who gets blamed and who not, it's just not who gets blamed and who's at fault, it's who gets listened to. Before we even get to determining who's at fault, it has to figure out who's being listened to. And I think when we have these systems that rely on safety, safety measures being predicated on the fact that someone has to say something, well, guess what? In a low-income community of color where there's a single mother working 3 jobs, she might very well know that road is unsafe. but that is not her biggest priority. So if she has to go to a community meeting or download another app on her phone or take the time to go through a long form, you know, when, how, right? If there are young people who walk and take transit or whatever it takes to get to school, and in addition to thinking about the speed of traffic and the width of lanes and the way it is completely unsafe for them to walk or bike to school, they're also worried about whose gang territory they're on. And if they can walk down the street and the city, you know, that came in and put this bike lane in, like, you know, didn't really think about any of these other factors. And so the answer to that could be that we listen to community, and it should be, but it should also be that when we talk about shared responsibility, and I saw someone say this in the chat, but when we talk about shared responsibility, it just can't be on individuals. And that's one of the things that makes America, America, this individualistic way of thinking about things. It also happens to be one of the tenets of white supremacy, that there is this idea that as individuals, you know, you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps and you can have the most successful career and fix traffic safety in your neighborhood all at the same time. And there isn't a true collective where also government is part of that collective, and also private consultants are part of that collective, engineers and planners. It's not just we have to listen to the community, and if they tell us, then we'll fix it. It's we all have to take the responsibility when we're going into places and when we're planning for communities. We have to take the responsibility to do some basic understanding and not just have cultural competency. I think we have to realize we're past a point of cultural competency, and we're really to a point of cultural flexibility, of cultural specificity, and really, really learning that, again, we have to just get beyond these narratives of fault and responsibility, and we have to figure out who are we listening to and who are we creating space for. And the last thing I'll say on this is the piece that can't be denied about this is that some of that is sure going to take changes again from individuals and from the collective, you know, shared way we look at these issues as a nation. But part of that is going to require our industry and our various professions, whether it's planners, whether it's engineers, whether it's designers or landscape architects, it's going to require us looking inward and saying, we have some shared responsibility. We have to take, you know, some of that blame and some of that fault on, because when we're in positions where we can hire a more diverse workforce, where we can have training that teaches the future generation of folks who are going out there to think about these issues and to be thoughtful about them, you know, that's on us too. And so I think sometimes, especially when we're doing equity related stuff, we get immediately to how does this look in the world? What should we be doing externally facing to change the outcomes? And we get so outcome specific that we often forget that on the way to outcomes, there is a process and there are people enacting that process. And those are things we also have to focus on when we're doing this work.
Thank you, Tamika. And just so you know, I didn't know it was possible to actually create a fire emoji in Zoom, but a colleague here has.
Lindsay
yes.
is one of the best at creating diamonds.
I'm saying, I mean, so yes, there's so much, I mean, it would take us a while to pick apart everything you've just contributed, Tamika. Thank you for all of that. People really are speaking about this cultural flexibility notion that you mentioned. Yes, agreed. We're beyond cultural competency, right? Specificity, flexibility. Laura's offering, yes, systems thinking and adaptive leadership. Exactly. This process that you're talking about to the outcome, who's defining, first of all, what the outcome is, right? If this is desirable, who decided that? And how are you getting there? Exactly. I think, and who are you listening to? I think it's great. So thank you for all of that. Would other colleagues like to ask questions or build upon what you guys offered? Again, we could probably just go right to the chat here and see. It's remarkable.
I think one quick comment I'll make you know, a lot of what Tamika said, I really kind of view that as the next generation of, you know, we talk about systemic safety. You know, we talk about, you know, looking at the risk factors, roadway design characteristics, things of that nature that contribute to a risky roadway, you know, rather than, you know, waiting for crashes to happen at a particular location, waiting for, you know, reports to come in to say, hey, this particular block, this particular intersection, I don't feel safe here. You know, I think instead, you know, we need to continue to evolve, you know, how we're thinking about the roadway network systemically. And like to Tamika's point about, you know, well, there may be the mother with 3 jobs, you know, really just struggling to make ends meet, you know, mindful of, you know, traveling on particular roadways, and not even necessarily because of the design, but because of other, you know, socioeconomic, demographic factors and so on. We need to do a better job of, you know, understanding how all that stuff ultimately, you know, ties back to, you know, safe and efficient mobility. You know, it's not enough just to build the road to connect point A to point B. You know, we need to understand, you know, what are the variety of factors, even if we think we've got a good design, or, you know, we've got a bike lane, we've got a wide sidewalk, we've got, you know, 10-foot lanes, and that enough may not be alone to solve the mobility issue for the entire population. So we just need to do a better job of understanding what are all the non-engineering or the non-technical factors that, you know, go into influencing individual mobility and accessibility.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah. We have some really good conversation in the chat too. People, Jonathan saying that, you know, thinks that another place, the climate fight is a good partner for street safety, right? Climate change. So these are relating safety to other kind of socially important outcomes, and important for whom exactly, right? We want to look at the power dynamics. Who seems to have a voice in all of this, to what Tamika was saying. And Steve, right, being more thoughtful around our design. You know, what purpose is this serving exactly? For whom is it solving, maybe, or addressing at least some other problems and some other issues that are very pressing, like climate, but also things that are, you know, very much existing today, like the various health and well-being inequities and things like this. All right, well, as we continue to see a lot of activity in the chat, we'll go to basically solving all the problems we've laid out today. So, I mean, everyone rest assured, we're about to head there. We'll go back to the top of the list here with Kelsey, because we started with you. So we'll start here with you and really start thinking about what you had said earlier around kind of community care and concern around traffic safety. It's not only the concern that might be changing a bit, but it's even if we had concern, we really have to focus on the framing. So with that, what are, in your mind, some approaches, policies, interventions worth trying to both raise the profile of road trauma as a pressing public health issue, but also start thinking about the way we discuss that in the public forum?
Thanks, Seth. And there are so many different things that we can do. I'm going to speak to just one of them, and that is how news coverage describes crashes. So I've been doing quite a bit of work with Calvin Thigpen and Tara Goddard and Evan Yakabuchi on how we cover crashes today, and what that means for readers' perceptions of what we should be doing. And the thing I want to start with is that 81% of the time that a newspaper describes a crash, they use the phrase, "a pedestrian was hit." So this is, you know, over and over again, this is the phrase we encounter when we read a news story, "a pedestrian was hit." And what you notice very subtly is that this sentence construction makes the pedestrian the star of the show. There's no agent, right? No one hit the pedestrian. There's not an agent there. And when there is an agent, it's often a car. And a pedestrian was hit by a car. newspapers refer to that car 4 times more often than they refer to a driver. And so I conducted an experiment with my colleagues and said, what happens if we shift that from a pedestrian was hit to a driver hit a pedestrian? Ran an experiment. The results are pretty remarkable. 30% shift in blame. So we shift from victim blaming to blaming the driver. I want to be really clear at the beginning. I talked about these different ways of framing pedestrian safety. I don't want to blame the driver either, right? There are rare cases in which it is the fault of a driver acting recklessly, but this is a systems issue. So we also tested a different version, a third version of the story. And we said, what happens if we provide some context about the roadway? What happens if we add some data about crashes on this street in particular and nationwide? We think of these things as thematic framing. If we think of it not just as a single crash, but as a constellation of crashes and a constellation of characteristics of the roadway. When readers encountered that, their shift to other factors, their blame, I should say, assigned to other factors, almost tripled, right? So we're seeing that a single article is able to shift what drivers think or what readers think happened in a crash. And best of all, we asked them, what are you willing to do to improve crash safety or pedestrian safety? And just that shift in reading a single article changed the things they were willing to support. It's really kind of amazing. If this sort of crash coverage was universal, you can imagine that the conversations we would be having would move out of venues like this and into the public sphere. And I want to highlight just one other thing that I'm doing. Well, I should say, Seth has done amazing work in this space as well, and definitely worth talking about, Seth, what you've done in this space. But I'm working with my team to move one level up. So we know that crash reporting tends to parrot almost word by word what the police report says. And today we're speaking, or I should say this week, we're speaking with police in New Jersey and elsewhere to change the way that they describe crashes so that we can sort of start upstream and change this conversation for everyone.
Thank you for doing that, Kelsey. That's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, the way we talk about things, the way we frame who's responsible and who's, yeah, like you said, the pedestrian was the star in almost everything, but they were struck by these strange objects all the time. Exactly. And that's great to hear that you're speaking to often the source of this news coverage. Yeah, we definitely had seen that. We've seen this sort of practice of almost stenography, right? Just what the law enforcement agencies are saying, get into the reporting of them. You can imagine how that might, relate to the way, we talk about it in the public, right? So it's one thing in a survey experiment, we're kind of alone, but we might start speaking about it differently with one another. And you can kind of see how this might relate to maybe more action on, protecting road users and such. That would be lovely if we did see that over time, right? Thank you for sharing that. And kudos on your awesome research in that space. Christy, back to you. So earlier you provided us, and thank you so much for your perspective on how basically you see the public perceiving road trauma and how things might be changing, especially you were referencing kind of the growth of victim advocacy in the US and in certain cities. Looking forward to what are some things local and state governments and community groups can and should do to support victims of traffic violence and their loved ones? So this relates to what you were saying earlier. Do we want to put all the onus on them to be basically the drivers of change? What are some things they can do to be supported by our governments?
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about how to design to prevent crashes and stuff, but I'm going to speak a little bit to the experience of an impacted visual after a crash. And I think one way is that local governments can support people who've been impacted either through the loss of a loved one or have been severely injured in a crash is to actually beef up their funding for support programs and victim advocacy. If there is a larger pot of money that helps people go through physical therapy if they were injured, or perhaps just to go to a therapist to talk about the emotional and spiritual impacts that they've had from the loss of a loved one or having survived a very serious crash and struggling through recovery. What are some of those programs that a city can help provide. And I know some cities do already provide those resources. I've learned that here in DC, the Office of the Medical Examiner actually has a little list of resources that refer families to who to talk to. But in my research and talking with other families of looking at the forms that they have to fill out and the proof that they have to provide that someone had lost their life, it's just a lot to handle for someone to jump through the hoops for potentially some sort of help to pay for some therapy, for example. And I think a larger issue that I've been personally thinking about and not sure how to do or how to address, but I will say quite clearly and upfront that the systems that victims have to rely on after a crash are not restorative, they're not helpful. Here's a enforcement system, an investigation, and a legal system that I have to follow that may be in conflict of my values, but I may be personally, maybe after a traumatic event, might feel inclined to try to pursue a legal case against someone who struck me, for example, metaphorically speaking. And so like what's there for people to rely on is not restorative. If someone lost a loved one and feels like they are pursuing a legal action against a driver, for example, and writes a victim impact statement advocating for a lengthy jail time based on whatever circumstance, like in a few years, will that person feel good about their decision? Does that help them honor their loved one's memory? Will they, it's just a very, I haven't heard great reviews or experiences of what people do after a crash and what systems they have there to rely on. So like, how do we move from the justice, quote unquote, justice system we have now to something of restorative justice or transformative justice? How do we build in community accountability and take some of those principles that I'm only starting to read about and try to educate and try to share the learnings with my fellow peers of, yes, we all feel personally impacted, and I might be mad and I might want justice, but for one of my colleagues who, she was in a serious crash and they actually found the driver who had struck her, my colleague learned that the driver was an undocumented person with no insurance, no license. She doesn't feel good about going after that person in a legal sense because that just doesn't make her go to bed well at night. And so she's actually decided to push that out of her brain and to focus on advocacy, and has been working with us, part of DC Families for Safe Streets, of how can she proactively work on her end so no one other experiences what she has. And so, but that's a decision she has to make. And most people rely on what's there, and what's there is a system that perpetuates probably everything awful that we all agree on in terms of oppressing probably a certain group of people who felt like they needed to flee from a crash. So I'm not sure how we even begin to solve those problems, but I think it is something that we need to have more discussions on, especially in the shared responsibility concept, like what happens after a crash and does the justice and legal system that we currently have, how can that be changed so it's actually more restorative for those who are involved?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, restorative, exactly. Like you said, it occurs, right, that a lot of the kind of, not principles, but sort of the elements of safe systems as it's defined is around post-crash care. And I don't know to what extent what you're describing is actually included in the definition of post-crash care. It's usually sort of EMS response, right? But these take on a life of their own after an event, right? So yeah, thank you for reflecting on what is it that would provide that sort of restorative justice, procedural justice, yeah, whatever that is. It'd be interesting to sort of start exploring what cities could do as a service to people who, are victims of these, of road trauma, basically. So thank you for sharing that, Christy. Steve, I think we'll go back to you really quickly here and just, reference what you were saying around our colleagues in transportation agencies, not necessarily the colleagues, it's basically more the practice, right?
Mhm.
And how the current practice, the status quo, they contribute to road user safety in so many ways, right? What, from your perspective, would have to change? Kind of asking for a little bit of specificity here. What would have to change for these agencies to basically assume greater responsibility for the injuries on our roads? Not to say let's put it all on them, but seeing their role in all of this, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, so I won't, talk about everything under the sun. I mean, a couple of specific dimensions that come to mind. I think first and foremost, within an agency, and when I mean agency, I mean like at a city level or state governments, just getting better at talking to each other within that organization. I mean, I've led workshops, I've participated in workshops where you get a number of different stakeholders from engineering, planning, law enforcement, et cetera, even some of like the maintenance folks and things like that. You get them together in a room and they're all with the same agency, and you'll bring up a topic. You'll just talk about road safety in general, and you'll end up having 5, 6 different perspectives, or you'll have, oh, well, we're doing this. Oh, well, I didn't know you're doing that because we're doing this. And there's often very little coordination or consultation, across silos within an individual agency. The left hand doesn't always know what the right hand is doing, even though sometimes what the right hand's doing may be counter to what the left hand is trying to achieve. So it's not enough just to have developed a Vision Zero statement for your agency and broadcast it out and said, here's our policy. Make sure you're reflecting these ideals and these principles in your daily work. You've got to have ongoing training. You've got to have ongoing workshops, get-togethers, really candid conversations around, what are we all doing within this larger space or this larger umbrella of Vision Zero and safe systems? What are we seeing that works well? What are we seeing that doesn't work well? And, why do we think, certain things are working well or are not working well? So I think just having a more, structured, routine means of communication within an agency is one. I think another thing that can be helpful is just this general willingness to continue, experimenting and trying out, different technologies, looking at, alternative performance measures, alternative means to use some of the existing data that we have. There's when it comes to like public agency liability, there's always been this standard of care where, we as the transportation professionals have a standard of care for the roadway and for road users to ensure some level of safety. Well, there's different kinds of, when it comes to identifying a deficiency in that standard of care, there's different means of identification of some of those deficiencies. Two of the biggest ones, there's what's called actual notice, and then there's what's called constructive notice. An actual notice would be something like, me sending an email to the city traffic engineer saying, hey, I feel this roadway is really unsafe, or, I had a near miss at this location, or, there's a clear deficiency at this particular, spot or on this particular roadway. Constructive notice, on the other hand, is more about the roadway agency or the infrastructure owner operator should know that there is a safety deficiency or a performance deficiency at a location. You can imagine if an agency never maintained their traffic signals and all the lights burnt out after a while, you'd have crashes and people would be getting hit. Well, obviously the agency should know that not maintaining their traffic signals is going to lead to some safety issues. We're in a very interesting time right now where that notion of constructive notice is pretty rapidly changing to the point where the courts and some recent legal decisions have made it clear that we as road safety professionals and infrastructure owner operators should know, or should be able to know, that things like speeding, disregard of traffic control devices, things like that are contributing to an actively dangerous state on the roadway. Where we haven't gotten to completely yet is, understanding the full dimensionality of that. Like, what are performance measures and what are the full set of tools and techniques that we can use to, qualify a road as safe versus unsafe. So, using things like, conflict analysis, surrogate safety measures and near misses, through things like, camera technology, not the cameras that, do facial recognition. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like, cameras that, record at an intersection, we can identify vehicles and pedestrians and bicyclists and, look at the dynamics of those routine interactions. I mean, that's one way that we can carry this forward. And then just, being willing to try out new performance measures. One thing that's interesting we're working on here in Detroit right now is we're actually seeing in a lot of the neighborhoods sort of, different parts of town that have been, historically underinvested in over the last couple of decades. And we see a lot of safety issues. We see a lot of issues with mobility and accessibility. And what we're seeing is, looking at the crash data in some of those neighborhoods, the proportions, we look at proportions of injuries and fatalities and things of that nature. We're actually finding a lot of these inner city neighborhoods that have crash patterns that actually match up more closely with what I might expect in a rural area. So a lot of the crashes that we have data on in those areas, almost all are fatal or serious injury. They tend to be high speed. And it's not necessarily to say that all of these neighborhoods are like rural areas, but rather it goes back to understanding the reporting mechanism for some of these crashes. In a lot of these inner city neighborhoods, people, you do not want to interact with law enforcement. You don't want to, you're walking, you're biking, you've been hit by a vehicle, you're probably not going to call the police. Like, that data point's not going to get reported up, and we're just not going to have data on those kinds of interactions or those kinds of issues. And so we're looking at, some of the existing data that we have, and not just looking at the data itself, but also looking at what are we missing? What are the deficiencies, and doing some of that pattern analysis to kind of come up with different ways of building this case for, is this roadway, safe versus unsafe? So yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now.
So that's it, huh, Steve? Okay.
Yeah, we're done now.
All right, good. That's great. Yeah, you touched upon a lot. And in the chat, people were responding. You touched upon issues of liability, these sort of performance measures you're referencing. Yeah, these sort of redundancies built in, right, into the system to keep people safe, but also the reporting side of things, like there's systematic sort of omissions in our data, or even, right, and how responsive we are to understanding who's actually being impacted by this. It was interesting how you kind of related to looking like a rural area, because yeah, you're right, you tend to see like higher injury crashes and kind of more sparsely laid out and things. So thank you for that perspective, Steve, and I hope people are paying attention to that, because they can unpack that for probably months. And last and certainly not least, I do want to turn to our colleague Tamika. And as we shared earlier, you shared so many other things earlier too, which were super valuable. Some groups, some processes basically are dictating the social narratives around fault, around the purpose of roads, around how they're functioning, the responsibility for injury, and then of course excluding and repressing others' voices and perspectives. And the question, I guess, is really around what are some means, and maybe you have some examples in mind, Tamika, around greater inclusion in telling the story around, road user injury, safety, responsibility, these sorts of things.
Yeah, I think, Steve said this repeatedly earlier, we have to listen to people. And I think, you know, having known Christy for a bit and watched her work and admired her work, I think there are groups like Christy's, not just, you know, in her region. I think what we often don't realize is sometimes as government agencies, sometimes as consultants doing this work, we like to say, we want to listen to people, but let's create some system or some process or do something from scratch because we're the first people to ever think of this, and let's be innovative and let's get people to the table. And I think this is a prime example of, we don't need to get people to our table. We need to figure out where people are already having these conversations. We need to figure out where folks are already talking about this, and we need to go to their table. And I think that sometimes that's in looking at, you know, particular advocacy groups whose whole missions are around this issue. And something I always say is sometimes it's just talking to the kids who hang out every day in front of that building on the corner. The grandmother who everyone in her neighborhood knows is looking out the window and keeping an eye on everything, but also can tell you everything you need to know about how people speed down the street. I think often what we find is when there is some major crash and you see the news crew go out and talk to people in the moment, if you look at a lot of those interviews, there's people saying, oh yeah, this always happens. People do this, this, and this, and you know, we've been saying. And so I think part of what's happening is, as professionals, we like to professionalize everything. And now as professionals, that more people are starting to talk about equity and listening and underrepresented voices, you know, they want to put together white papers and events around it. And I think all of that is important. Like, welcome to the party. We're glad you're joining us. But I also think it's about just realizing that there's already an ecosystem out there in communities. There's already things happening. There's already people talking. And that sometimes the best research we can do is not just going to be community informed, but also community led. And really relying on the fact that even when people have other issues that are more pressing to them, it doesn't mean they don't care. It's just, how do we elevate voices by talking about issues like traffic safety in a way that ties to the other things that are important to them? So how can we start approaching these conversations differently, in a more intersectional way, in a more person-centered way, right? Stop talking about pedestrians and cyclists and drivers, but people who ride their bikes, people who walk, people who drive, acknowledging that there are folks at the intersections of those things, depending on the day and the time, and really make this work people-centered and relevant, so that it doesn't just resonate with those of us who have the luxury and privilege and nerdiness that want to sit on something for an hour and a half, but also those folks on the front line who are dealing with this in every day and might be using a different language, but are just waiting for the question to be asked in the right way.
Amen, Tamika. Thank you for this. Yes, you're getting a lot of affirmation from your colleagues here on the side, on the chat. Yeah, community led. You know, one of the interesting things you had said to me, one of the many interesting things you had said was how there's sort of a whole ecology of knowledge, a plurality of knowledge within communities. When we looked at, so Kelsey referenced this, when we were looking at sort of TV broadcast coverage of traffic events, of traffic crashes, when they use thematic, so that's something Kelsey talked about, thematic frames, talking about how this is part of the system, or this is something that happens here a lot. It was almost always in reference to when they talked to neighbors, when they had an opportunity to talk to some people in the community. They're like, oh yeah, if you just came down here before, we could have told you that this would happen, and this would happen repeatedly, you know, and this is the kind of thing that they would report. And it's like, to your point around, we try to over professionalize things, right? We're not using data. We're not defining data as just talking to somebody. That's not valid data, right? In professionals, that's not something you can put into a model very easily. But, right, so I guess the question for everyone, we're all in this space to some extent. Christy, even you, I would imagine you probably use even reported crashes a lot of times, right? How do we deprofessionalize this? Or how do we elevate, to Tamika's point, like, how do we elevate the perspectives of people in their communities, these people riding bikes, these people walking? How do we elevate their perspectives, their voices as actual, very high quality data around what reality actually is? It's a very easy question.
I guess I'll start. Like, as one example, I think last November I was on a walk with my family, and my son was almost struck by a car, and he was pretty shaken up, but wanted to kind of just like move on. And I actually knew that was a spot where the community had been trying forever to get a stop sign and was denied because it was a minor arterial or something. So they like didn't want to do anything about it. So I bribed them with, I think, $5 in Roblox money to write a letter to our local Department of Transportation and say, like, describe what happened to you and just say what happened to you, and that's all you need to say. And so he wrote it, I sent it in, I shepherded it a couple of times, made sure it got to the right people. And that's only me with my privilege of my local busybody work, and I know who I need to talk to. But finally, that helped contribute to all the other community requests, and we actually did get a stop sign. And so encouraging people, I know not everyone has the time or privilege or knows who to talk to, but like, start getting young people involved and tell them, like, this is the thing that you can request. And yes, I did endure about 6 months of, oh, did they put the stop sign in yet? And it's like, this is too soon. We've been trying for like 10 years. But getting young people involved and knowing that they have a voice, and also when the thing happens, because it's the local Department of Transportation, I still need to follow up on this, but we need to go take a photo with him in the stop sign and send a thank you note, because I think they hear from us a lot, and sometimes they don't hear the good things that the community actually values in our work. So getting young people involved.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, they're supposed to have a lot of energy and stuff, right? The youth, yeah. I mean, I know we don't want to bring back, child labor, but this is great that they I think often do want to contribute in that way, and they find it very valuable. They find it meaningful, right? We've definitely seen that working with communities. We see the young people stepping up and often speaking about what their elders are experiencing, right? They're the ones sort of conveying that to the research groups and such.
And it's definitely, they have the energy, I think, sometimes, and the lack of being jaded. But I also think all of us who work in this space know how long things take, right? Any of us who have done safe routes to schoolwork know that the kids you start with aren't necessarily the kids you end with. But I also think, we have to start looking at transportation as an investment in our future, not as something in the background that just happens, but in the same way that we talk about climate, related work being an investment in the future. In the same way we talk about education work being an investment in the future, I think transportation needs to be mentioned in the same breath as all of those things, because a lot of those things are transportation dependent, right? Can't talk about quality education if you can't get there. Can't talk about quality public health if you can't get there. Needless to say, the number of fatalities and injuries we're seeing because of traffic lack of safety is a public health issue, especially for young people. And so I also think it's who's most impacted, right? And something I always advise people when you're making a decision, when you're planning a project, ask who's going to be the most impacted. And I think a lot of times it is young people. And then look around that decision-making table and see if those folks who are going to be the most impacted are there. And I think often the case is that they are not. And that's how we know we have a power imbalance. That's how we know we don't have the right voices in the room. And I think that's another reason we really have to, if these are the folks who are going to have to deal with the project that takes a very long time, let's hear from them and hear what they have to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And Steve.
Seth, another point I would make is, we've spent this whole time talking about systems and systems level thinking. And I feel like too often we're still acting like all of these different observations and symptoms and characteristics, they like all kind of exist in isolation. And, I guess to give an example, I saw a message come up in the chat, and I can't find it now. It was a comment about, people in underserved communities don't generally ride bicycles. And on the surface, yeah, okay. I guess my response to that would not necessarily be, okay, well, let's not build bike lanes, or let's not, cater to that kind of roadway user. I guess then I would ask the question, well, why is a person in an underserved community not riding a bicycle? And, you could pick that apart a little bit further. It may be that, well, someone in the underserved community, maybe they can't afford a bicycle. So then I would look at, okay, well, is there a way that we can provide that kind of infrastructure, not just the bike lane, but maybe also the bicycles? Because we know that, bike riding and other kinds of active transportation have a lot of health benefits, and instead of, not just mobility and accessibility. You can take that even in a step further, because like we have a bike share system here in Detroit, and they've been working to expand, free passes and, bike share, bikes and things like that into some of these underserved communities, but they're still not seeing the success or the level of adoption that we want. Well, why is that happening? Well, it's because in order to get the free pass, you've got to have the smartphone app, and you've got to be able to pull up the pass. And a lot of people in underserved communities don't have smartphones, or they don't have access to a bank account. And so we really need to be able to, pick a thread and just kind of like pull the thread and see how it unravels, and be willing to have honest conversations around, I came up with this great plan for a bike share system, but it's not working like I expected it to, or it's not serving the individuals who really need or really could benefit from having access to this. And so, that's not to say, well, they should go get smartphones, or get a bank account. That the onus comes back to me, the engineer or the professional, so to speak, to really have a hard conversation with myself, with hires up. We need to take these more drastic steps in order to make sure that we're getting the resources into the hands of the people that can benefit the most from them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just add, I know we're over time. Low-income folks do ride bikes. I think, if you look at any of the data, Black folks and Latinx folks, Hispanic folks, depending on where you are in the country, Latino folks, how you describe them, they're the fastest rate of folks who are growing as cyclists. And I would also say that low-income folks of color do ride bikes. They're just often invisible riders, right? But if you go to any restaurant and you look out back and you see who's chained up their bikes, I think everyone doesn't have the option to have a car. But I also think we have to get away from what the comment said, forcing bike lanes on folks, because I also think there are communities where folks might not want them. There are communities where folks are in this position of feeling like, sure, a young white kid, you can ride up to your job smelly and sweaty from riding your bike, but I got to get people to respect me, and the color of my skin makes that even harder. So I really can't ride a bike to work because I'll be judged differently than you'll be judged. So I think, I think to Stephen's point, it's all about the nuance, and it's all about just asking. When someone says, I don't want this, instead of just saying, okay, part of doing good community engagement is saying why. And remaining curious. And I think too often we get defensive because we think we have the best solution. But if we really approach these conversations from a place of curiosity, then it is really, really hard. It's really, really hard to get defensive.
Yeah. Yep. Yes, indeed. And I know we are over time. Thank you both for your perspectives on this. I think you're right. We're now speaking about our role, and this is a kind of a valuable role that we can increasingly play if we're going to be engaging with community members. And Tamika, to your point earlier around flexibility, specificity, it is about the nuance. It is about and the investment in the future, thinking about the kids, who stands to benefit most from all of this, right? from all these changes that we're trying to propose that we had preconceived notions about. No, we really want, you know, like we've been saying this time together around community-led. And that includes the whole breadth, right? Down to how we grieve, everything, right? So when we talk about shared responsibility, we all have responsibility. I think what it is, we want to be reflecting upon what it is our role is within this system. What can we be doing to lift up, to center and decenter some perspectives that, you know, maintain the status quo? That's not working for everybody, clearly. So I don't know, Kristen, if you're on the line, I think we are going to kind of wrap things up, given that we're over time. But
Yeah,
I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this awesome conversation today. Thanks to each of you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you guys, not very many people have signed off yet, so you clearly had an engaged audience, but I really want to respect our panelists' time as well. So thank you all for joining us here today. The recording will be up midweek next week, and I dropped the links to sign up for our last session and to check out the previous sessions. So, and thank you to Seth for moderating this. I feel like you guys could have gone for 6 hours. We just need a bathroom break and a snack break here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar, but thank you guys very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.